Thank you for joining us again for our study in the book of Revelation. We are going through a verse-by-verse, chapter-by-chapter study of this amazing book. And I hope it'll give you a lot of insights into who Jesus Christ is in His glorified state, as well as God's plan for the ages. You may notice I've dressed a little bit differently today, and our stage is a little bit different. This week at our church, and you're probably watching sometime after this, but we've got Vacation Bible School. Mystery Island is our theme. And we're encouraged by the number of children that are coming out. Maybe you live in the Goodview area. Let me just put a plug in for our children's program and our youth program here at the church. If you have children or teenagers that are not involved in church, or maybe you're not involved in a church anywhere locally, we'd encourage you to come and visit with us here at Goodview. We've got a children's director that will be starting in August. Maybe you're watching after that and she's already here. My associate pastor also works with the youth. He's been with us over 20 years now. And we want to invest into the lives of our young people, not just teaching them the Bible, but getting them involved in ministry and using their gifts and ability for the Lord. So if we can help you any with our children's ministry or you want some more information about that, just call the church and we'll be glad to get back in touch with you. The book of Revelation, I'm sort of going to break down into four categories. The first is chapter 1. And in chapter 1, the Apostle John describes Jesus Christ in all of His glory. And then chapters 2 and chapter 3 are letters that are written to 7 churches in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Western Turkey. And then chapters 4 through chapter 19 describes the great tribulation that's going to come upon this earth when God pours His wrath out on this world for their rebellion and for their wickedness. And then the last couple chapters of Revelation, chapters 20 through chapters 22, Jesus comes back to this earth. He'll set up His kingdom in which He'll reign for 1,000 years. And then the Bible says there'll be a new heaven and a new earth. So it's a great book, and I hope that you've joined with us for the other studies and will continue to go with us as we go through this verse by verse and chapter by chapter. I brought a couple objects with me today. The first thing I brought is a magnifying glass. Probably many of you have used magnifying glasses before. I also have my reading glasses with me. Somebody told me a few years ago, said, you know, Joey, when you get in your early 50s, you're probably going to need glasses. Well, at that time, I had 20/20 vision. I didn't think that'd be necessary. But when I was about 53 or 54, that's exactly what started happening. When I looked at the print in my Bible, it was a little bit fuzzy, a little bit hazy. It was hard to make out what the words were. And so I just got a pair of reading glasses, and I used them to magnify the print and make it easier for me to read. Some people might even use magnifying sheets. We could talk about microscopes or telescopes, or I didn't want to bring my rifle today with my scope on it. I thought that'd be a little bit unusual to bring and maybe a little bit offensive to some people. But what magnifying glasses do, as you know, they magnify something. They make them bigger so you can see it. And so if you have watched television or read books, you may be familiar with Sherlock Holmes. And some of the iconic things about Sherlock Holmes was the hat that he wore, the sort of the trench coat look he had. He always had a pipe in his mouth, but he always had a magnifying glass. He would be like a modern-day Columbo. He could just look at clues and detect things that other people couldn't see. And then he would use his logic to figure out the case in which he was studying. And so magnifying glasses help us. We might be looking at fingerprints, or we might be looking at some fine print on a letter, or maybe in your Bible. Some of you may even have large print Bibles. You can look at sails through a magnifying glass, things that you can't see with the naked eye. Telescopes are used to look at stars to bring them closer, to be able to see their shapes and things about them. And then if you hunt, a lot of people will use scopes to see animals, to see what type of animal it was. If you're deer hunting, is it a doe or a buck? How many points maybe the deer has? And so in the book of Revelation, the reason I use the idea of a magnifying glass is Jesus is seen looking at the churches. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let me read Revelation chapter 1 and verse 9 to you. I, John, am your brother and your partner in suffering and in God's kingdom, and in the patient endurance to which Jesus calls us. I was exiled to the island of Patmos for preaching the Word of God and for my testimony about Jesus. You remember in a previous lesson we talked about the fact that John was a prisoner or a criminal of the Roman government. The crime listed against him was that he believed the Bible and he preached the Bible. And he believed that Jesus Christ was the Messiah and the hope of Israel. Well, this was not only an offense to the Roman government, it was an offense to the Jewish nation. Because the Jews did not believe that Jesus was their Messiah. They believed he was an impostor. Remember in the Gospel of John, the first chapter, it says that Jesus came into his own, talking about the Jewish nation. But his own received him not. They rejected him as their Messiah. John was one of the first apostles that Jesus called to follow him. He left his father's commercial fishing business to follow Jesus and lived with him for the next 3.5 years until he died. You remember John was actually at the cross when Jesus died and was entrusted by Jesus the care of his mother. And so John had a very close relationship with Jesus. He even referred to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. John was probably in his late 20s, maybe early 30s when he began to follow Jesus. But now we're some 65 years later. John is probably in his mid-90s, maybe a little bit older than that even. And he's remembering back through the years of what Jesus did when he was alive. And now he has a picture of the glorified Christ. But he's exiled to this island of Patmos, probably about 35 to 50 miles off the coast of Ephesus. He thinks he's there to die. But God unveils or reveals to him his plan for the ages, as well as the glorified Christ. John had the unique opportunity to see Jesus in his incarnation when he lived on earth as a man. And now he sees him in his glorified state after he's ascended to heaven and come back to give him this unveiling of the book of Revelation. In verse 11 and 12, we looked at this last week, I believe. It says, "And he said, write in a book everything you see, and send it to the 7 churches in the cities of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. When I turned to see the one who was speaking to me, I saw 7 gold lampstands." Here's a map of where these churches are located. It's called Asia Minor in John's day, but today it would be Western Turkey. And you can see on the map Ephesus and Smyrna, Pergamus, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. It was a circular route. John at one time had been the pastor at Ephesus. Probably when he was arrested by the Roman government, that's what he was doing. He had some knowledge of these churches, maybe some oversight of these other 7 churches. Most scholars believe that these are not only literal churches that existed in John's day, but they also represent church history. Things that have happened from the beginning of the church in the book of Acts chapter 2 until the rapture of the church. 7 periods of church history. That doesn't mean that every church fits into this category in the different ages over the past 2,000 years. But many of these characteristics are true of churches today and throughout time. So John is told to write to these churches. As you read the last verse of Revelation chapter 1, you see that these gold candlesticks represent the 7 churches. And so John sees Jesus walking in the midst of these candlesticks. That's why I use the illustration of the magnifying glass or magnifying sheets or glasses or telescopes, whatever you might want to use. It helps us see things better. Now, I might have an opinion of our church, and people in our church might have certain things they like about our church or certain weaknesses they wish we would work on some. And those can be valid points that people might share and suggestions they might give. But what's even more important is, what does the Lord think about our church? Or the things that He would point out as our strengths, or things that He would point out as our weaknesses, things that we need to keep doing well, and things we need to change. As John writes these letters to these 7 churches, that is going to be some of the characteristics you'll see in the letter. We have a lot of teachers in our church, and my wife has been a teacher for many years now. Every now and then during the school year, she'll say, you know, the principal's going to come and sit in my class today. Or somebody from the administration surprised me today and sat through one of my classes. And the reason is they want to observe what's going on. They want to see what the teacher does. They want to see how the class reacts to the teacher, or maybe even how the teacher reacts to the class when they may be doing things they shouldn't be doing. And then at a later date, there'll be a meeting set up between the teacher and the principal or the administration, and they'll give their observations of that class. Maybe you work at a business and maybe it's not an observation situation, but you have goals or quotas or situations that you have to meet at your work, and maybe on a quarterly basis or a yearly basis you gather with the head of the company and you talk about the goals and the status and the quotas and have you met your quotas, because they want the business to grow. Maybe some of you even work on commission. Maybe you're involved in sports, and if you're on sports teams, many times, especially in the high school and college level, even in the pro level, games are taped. And then there's a session where the players get together sometime during the week and they look at a game film. They may look at things they did in the last game. Maybe they missed a tackle, or maybe they didn't make a pass, or maybe they made some other mistake that is magnified by the replay of the video. That's what we see in sports today is instant replay. If an official's not sure he made the call right, they'll slow down the play and look at it very closely to make sure they make the right call. All those things play into what Jesus Christ was doing. John sees Jesus analyzing and scrutinizing and observing these churches. And then he gives a report to John of his findings. And then he asks John to write in a letter his report and send it to the churches so they'll know exactly what Jesus Christ thinks about their church, what is good and what is bad, what needs to be changed and what needs to be bolstered up some. So to me that begs the question, what makes a great church? Maybe you're looking for a church, and what type of church should you look for? What makes a really good church? Here's a picture of a large church with many people attending the worship there. Is that what makes a church great? For some people, greatness in a church is based on the size. The larger the church, the greater God's blessing. If they have a lot of people, if they have a lot of property and facilities, and they've got a good bank account and good finances, then people might look at that church and say, yeah, that's a great church. On the other hand, if it's small in stature and things not kept well and maybe just a little bit of money in the budget, not a lot of people attending there, people sort of look down and maybe don't want to go attend that church because of its size. Is size what makes a great church? Not necessarily. Well, maybe it's talent. Maybe you've got a talented pastor or a great staff and people that organize well. As we go through Bible school this week, I'm amazed at the things that our people have done in the decorations and the presenting of the lessons. There's a lot of talent. Does talent make a great church? Maybe it's a great music ministry and a lot of gifted people that can share musically or in leadership positions. Some people go to churches looking for programs. Is there something for my children? Is there something for my teenagers? Is there something for me to be involved in? Is there some social activity that I can do at the church? Does this church have small groups or discipleship or a good Sunday school program? When people visit churches, those are some of the things they look for. In today's society, people may wonder, does the church have a good media presence? Maybe are they on television? Are they on YouTube or Facebook? Or do they reach out in any other way to people in the community through online ministries? When I was growing up, a lot of people, especially a lot of pastors, believed that a great church was one that supported a lot of missionaries. I can remember going to church that supported maybe 15 or 20 or 30 missionaries. And they were so proud of the fact that they supported such a great number of missionaries. The difficult thing about that was they only supported them at $20 or $30 a month. Now that's helpful, but it's hard for a missionary to get to the field if that's the amount they have to generate from all churches to maybe raise $4,000 to $5,000 a month. What our church decided to do several years ago is support less missionaries at a larger amount, maybe $400, $500, $600, $700 a month, so they could get to the field a little bit quicker, but also so when they're home on furlough, they could spend more time with us. Not just come into one service and be there and then maybe see them 4 years later. Maybe come and spend a couple weeks at our church and minister to our church from the pulpit, maybe in Sunday school class, maybe meet with small groups and so forth. and allow our people to get to know the missionaries a little bit better. Some churches have the idea that if you're not involved in evangelism, if your people aren't sharing their faith, then there's something lacking in your church. Of course, I think when you look for a church, if you're in that process right now, you should find one that is doctrinally sound and morally pure. Do they teach the Bible? There's churches today, and it's almost hard for me to fathom this, they don't even bring their Bibles to church. They don't even preach in the Bibles. I'm not sure what they preach about, just some common issue in society. But here at our church, we try to make all of our services Bible-centered. There's other things that we might do, but there's a biblical reason behind what they do. What are people looking for in the church? Seeker-sensitive is a term that was coined a number of years ago. And some churches really do a good job in finding out what people in the community want from a church and then trying to match that need. Well, to me, that's almost like putting the cart before the horse. It's not really what do the people need, though that can be important. But what does Jesus Christ want to have happen in the life of the church? Not are we pleasing the people or the congregation, and I hope we do that, but are we pleasing the Lord? So as John writes to these churches, there are several characteristics you'll see in each of these letters. First of all, you're going to see a description of Jesus Christ. His characteristics or his traits will be expressed. Many of those go back to chapter 1. Every trait mentioned in chapter 1 is not given to all 7 churches, but some aspect of that characteristic is given to that church that would be important to them. When I do funeral services, I try to match some scripture to something that was important or a part of the individual's life. I just had a service a couple weeks ago for a man that was a farmer and he had a lot of cows. At one time he owned over 80 cows. In that message, I preached from Psalm chapter 23 for the eulogy. And I talked about how David was a shepherd and how that he loved his sheep and he cared for his sheep. There is some correlation between David being a shepherd and this farmer. He had to care for his cows like David for his sheep. And yet when you read the first verse of Psalm 23, it says this, "The Lord is my shepherd." David knew what it was like to care for the sheep, but he also knew what it was like for God to care for him. And so I use that in the illustration of this gentleman I had the service for, talking about that God cared for him and that he had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ as well. Now, everything that I talk about doesn't deal with animals, but I did have a service about a month ago for a man who had a lot of chickens. And that eulogy I talked about, what does the Bible say about roosters and chickens? It was sort of a unique message that I've never brought before and maybe never again, but I talked about Peter and how he rejected the Lord when he heard the rooster crow, reminded him that he promised he would never forsake the Lord and never deny the Lord. And then I talked about Jesus coming down from the Mount of Olives when he said, "How often would I have gathered you under my wings? I wanted to bring you and care for you like a chicken does her small babies, but you wouldn't listen and you wouldn't come to me." As John writes these letters, he gives one characteristic trait of Jesus to each of these churches. And then another characteristic of these letters is Jesus describes what the church is doing well. Jesus gives it to John, John writes it down, and sends it to the churches. What is our church doing well? Well, we might have a feeling of what we think we do well, but what does Jesus say we do well? On the other hand, John writes what Jesus reported that they were not doing well, things they needed to change. Now, each of these 4 things that I'm going to mention was not true in every letter to every church that John wrote to, but it was in many of the churches. The last thing was Jesus described a future blessing that's in store for those churches. If they would just listen to what God told them to do, God's blessings would be upon them. And so as we begin next week to look at the first of these 7 churches, you're going to see these characteristics. Something of what Jesus Christ was like in his glorified state. What Jesus said the church was doing well. What Jesus said the church needed to change. And if they were obedient, some future blessing that was in store for them in heaven. Today's quote, let me read to you. It's from Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13. "Nothing in all creation is hidden from God. Everything is naked and exposed before His eyes. And He is the only one to whom we're accountable. Imagine that Jesus is looking through a magnifying glass at your life. And He's trying to find the things in your life or in the life of your church that He likes or He doesn't like. Things that might be hidden from other people, but they're open to the Lord. You know, sometimes we have secrets that we don't want our spouse to know about or our kids to know about or even people at church to know about. And we think we're doing well in concealing those issues in our lives. And yet the Bible clearly says that the Lord knows everything about us. Don't just do what you do to please other people. Do what you do to please the Lord. The secrets that we try to keep from others are well known to the Lord. And so think about that this week in your meditation time. And the resource I have today, there's a little booklet called My Heart, Christ Home by Robert Munger. If you have a chance to pick up a copy of that book, or I think maybe even on YouTube some of it is there, I would encourage you to go and listen to that. That Christ dwells within us, and everything we should do please Him. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us next week for our study in chapter 2, the church at Ephesus.